Last week, I made a video about 30-year Treasury yields crossing 5% for the first time in nearly 19 years. And the response to that video told me something really important. A lot of you are paying very close attention to what's happening in this economy right now. It's not just on Wall Street, it's right here on Main Street. And at the end of that video, I said something that I want to come back to today and dig into a little more. I said that the rules of money that have worked for the last 15 years are actually being rewritten in real time. And I wasn't trying to be dramatic, I meant that literally. And today I want to expand on exactly what that means and dive deeper into some of the most important implications for this pretty significant macroeconomic shift. Because the 5% yield isn't simply a bond market story. It's one of the most significant changes that has followed the end of a 15-year experiment in cheap money. And right now in 2026, the bill for that experiment is starting to arrive in meaningful ways for everyone. Your mortgage payment, your car loan, your credit card balance, the reason the grocery store feels different than it did 5 years ago, even though your income went up, the reason you can't buy a house, even though you've done everything right. People keep pointing to inflation and a weakening or K-shaped economy, which are completely valid points and very real things that we've talked about before, but I think it gets deeper than that. So let me start with some context that I think is genuinely important, because if you don't understand where we came from, the last 3 years of this economy really don't make any sense. In 2008, as most of us probably know, the United States had its biggest financial crisis in nearly a century. Banks failed, the housing market collapsed, unemployment hit 10%, and in response, the Federal Reserve did something extraordinary. They cut the federal funds rate, and I have a video on what the Fed funds rate actually is and what it means for the economy overall if you want to check that out. But in short, the base cost of borrowing money that sends ripple effects through the entire US economy, they cut to essentially zero. Not just low, almost zero. Between 0 and 0.25% starting in December of 2008. And the thinking was make money cheap. If it costs almost nothing to borrow, people will borrow. They'll spend, they'll hire, the economy will recover. And it did work, mostly. But here's the problem. What began as an emergency policy response evolved into more than a decade of historically low interest rates and cheap money. From 2008 all the way to 2022, with one brief exception where the Fed brought rates back up a little bit between 2016 and 2019 before bringing them back down during COVID, we lived in a world of essentially free money. And to be clear, I'm not trying to say the policy is wrong. Reasonable people can agree or disagree on whether that's right or wrong. I'm simply saying that what began as an emergency response ended up shaping an entire generation's financial decisions. For 14 years, debt was cheap, borrowing was cheap, and the rules of building wealth, buying homes, running businesses, and planning for retirement were all built on a foundation of near zero interest rates. A whole generation of adults, myself included, have made nearly every financial decision: first home, first new car, retirement allocations, starting a business, based on rules that were meant to be temporary measures in a once-in-a-century situation. I don't think it was ever supposed to last this long when it was first put in place. But let's actually take it another way, out of the financial realm, to really wrap our minds around how significant this has been for people's lives and what the change means. Imagine that a city increased all of its speed limits to 100 miles an hour. Not because they were reckless, they genuinely didn't have that many cars on the road, and they needed traffic to move. So they basically said essentially no limits. Drive as fast as you need to in order to get where you want to go as fast as you can, because we need people to move. What would people do in that situation? Well, they would probably do what people do in any situation with major change. They adapt. So imagine for 14 years, people building neighborhoods around that reality, planning commutes, deciding what jobs to take based on that speed limit. They probably even designed new cars that would better handle higher speeds. People would design their entire lives around a world with basically no speed limits. It's hard to think about the domino effect of what would happen in a city like that if they then started having to bring those speed limits way down. That's exactly what we're dealing with in terms of money flow. In June of 2022, after cheap money was everywhere, the proverbial speed limits came back. And in less than 2 years, they didn't just come back. Borrowing costs went from basically zero to some of the highest we've seen in nearly 20 years. The rules of the road changed, and they changed fast. This is what the 5% yield on the 30-year Treasury represents. It's not just a number on a trader's screen. It is one of the results of this experiment coming to a close. It is one of the most obvious dominoes to fall in a new rate environment. And right now, we're living through the bill that has come due. I want to walk through exactly where that bill is showing up for people in real time, because I don't think most people are fully connecting the dots between their personal financial reality and the cheap money experiment that just ended. So let's connect them. The most immediate and visceral place you're feeling this, we're all feeling this, is housing. And I want to explain exactly why, because I think the explanation is actually more unsettling than the number itself. Now, this exact number is up for debate among economists, but somewhere around 10 million Americans locked in mortgages at 2.5%, 3.5% between 2020 and 2022, the near free money rates. Now, most of those people would normally sell their homes every 7 to 10 years, move up to a bigger place if you're growing your family, downsize if you are an empty nester, relocate for a new job. That's how housing inventory, that's part of how housing inventory works. People move, that movement creates opportunities, and a lot of those opportunities are for first-time buyers to get in the door. But here's what's happening right now. That family sitting on a 2.8% mortgage is doing the math. If they sell now, giving up that crazy low interest rate, and buy a new home today at, say, 7.5%, their monthly payment could go up $1,000, $1,500 or more per month for the same amount of house. So they're staying put. They are not selling, and it's been called the golden handcuffs. I actually used that phrase in my last video because that's exactly what it is. First-time buyers aren't just competing with elevated prices. They're competing with a frozen market. The people who should be selling, who would normally be selling by now, just can't stomach this rate differential. So inventory stays low, prices stay high, and the people who did everything right, who saved and built credit and waited for the right moment, they're still locked out. Not because of anything they did or didn't do, because 30 million people ahead of them in line got handcuffed to their current mortgage. This lock-in effect isn't the only reason inventory is constrained, but it's one of the most powerful forces shaping today's housing market. But what does that all mean for you? If you're renting right now, or if you're one of those people handcuffed to that lower rate and you're wondering, both sides are wondering why the housing market still doesn't make sense, even with everything that's happened, this is the structural reason. And it won't resolve cleanly until either rates come down, if rates come down enough that people are willing to move, or life circumstances eventually force sales regardless of the math. And either way, understanding the lock-in effect gives you a much more grounded picture of what we're actually dealing with. Now, housing, in my opinion, I think is the most visible place the experiment is unwinding, but I want to talk about the one doing the quietest damage, and that is consumer debt. During the free money era, consumer credit expanded significantly, and it wasn't entirely irrational. If borrowing costs were relatively low and wages were ticking up, the math on carrying a balance wasn't necessarily catastrophic for a lot of households. People borrowed for a lot of things too. They borrowed for cars, for home renovations, for appliances, for the kinds of purchases that felt manageable at the time. And when we were all in lockdown during COVID, the number of people who, because we were all stuck in our houses all the time, started doing home renovations, adding in pools, doing patios, adding in back houses as home offices, redoing bathrooms. Those amounts of renovations went up, and credit card companies made it very, very easy, because the more people borrow, the more money that these credit card companies make. How? Nearly half, about 46% of the credit card holders in the US do not pay their statement in full each month, which means credit card companies charge interest, very high interest on those balances. Total US credit card debt surpassed $1 trillion in 2024. And as of this year, the balances are somewhere around $1.25 trillion, over $1 trillion in credit card debt. And what's the average interest rate on that debt? Around 21 to 22%. Here's where cheap money ending matters in a very direct way. When mortgages, auto loans, and other borrowing costs were much lower, households often had more room in their budget to absorb credit card balances. Now those same households are paying 6.5 to 7.5% on a mortgage, 8% on a car loan, goodness, 22% plus on credit cards, and inflation at the same time has been chipping away at purchasing power for several years. The minimum payment that used to feel manageable has now eaten into budgets with almost no slack. And hear me, I think it's very important to say because I typically don't like the words always and never when we're talking about economic and financial conversations. But credit card debt is one of those few exceptions where, in my opinion, holding credit card debt is never a good idea. That's not to say don't use credit cards, but pay them off because the interest rates on credit cards are so exorbitantly high. Einstein called compound interest the eighth wonder of the world, and it is one of the most important reasons that investing is so powerful in building monetary wealth. But I think you could make an argument that it's like the eighth nightmare of the world when it compounds against you, which is exactly what happens with credit card debt. This is one reason a lot of people who earn more than their parents ever did still feel like they're falling behind month to month. Higher debt costs, higher housing costs, higher insurance costs, and the lingering effects of inflation have all squeezed household budgets at the same time. The rules of money that have worked for the last 15 years are being rewritten. I've said that a few times now, and this is exactly what I mean. This next one gets the least attention on Main Street, and I think it's because it sounds like this abstract fiscal policy that nobody really knows what to do with. It's one of those things a lot of people seem to always kind of be faintly aware of, but it feels like such an abstract idea to wrap our minds around in terms of the real world consequences to you. So let me make it concrete pretty quickly. During the free money era, it wasn't just American citizens borrowing a lot. The US government also borrowed massively. The COVID stimulus packages, the infrastructure programs, the ongoing federal deficits, all of it was financed by issuing Treasury bonds at historically low interest rates. When the 10-year Treasury was yielding 0.5%, it was very cheap for the government to borrow. So they borrowed a lot. Now the government has to do what a lot of people do, refinance that debt. Old bonds mature, new bonds have to be issued to replace them, and the rates on those new bonds are much higher, 4 to 5%. The result is that the United States is now spending more than $1 trillion a year just in interest payments on the national debt. $1 trillion per year just in interest, not even the principal. And for the first time in modern history, the US is now spending more on interest payments than it spends on the entire annual defense spending budget. Now, I want to be clear. This is not a political conversation. I genuinely am not interested about the framing of which administration ran up which portion of the deficit. I have no desire to get into a political finger-pointing match because, frankly, I don't really buy either side's argument at this point, and I think they're just two sides of the same power-hungry coin, and that's as political as you're ever going to hear me get. What I care about is what it means for the economy and for your wallet. And here's what it does mean. That $1 trillion in annual interest has to come from somewhere. It competes with every other federal spending priority we have. It creates fiscal pressure that shapes decisions about inflation, tax policy, and the long-term viability of programs that millions of Americans actually rely on, like Social Security and Medicare. These don't exist in a vacuum, disconnected from the federal balance sheet. They all matter, and they all influence one another. What happens in the bond market doesn't stay in the bond market. The 5% yield on that 30-year Treasury is one of the major inputs shaping the political and fiscal pressure of the next decade and probably beyond. And understanding that connection is genuinely worth having. And now, retirement. This one connects directly back to my last video, so if you watched it, some of this will feel familiar, but I want to take it a little further. In that video, I introduced this phrase TINA, T-I-N-A. It's been a common phrase in investing, and it stands for there is no alternative. It was the investing reality of the free money era. When Treasury bonds were yielding close to nothing, there was genuinely very little reason to put serious growth-oriented money there. So retirement portfolios over time became heavily concentrated in stocks. Index funds tracking the broad market, particularly large cap tech, became the default answer to how should I invest? And for 15 years, it's mostly worked. The S&P 500 went from 700 in early 2009 to over 5,000 in 2024, and we're at over 7,500 today. So if you parked money in an ETF and left it alone, you look like an investing genius. And many people, including finance influencers and content creators, some of whom may have been very well intentioned, have basically said, just throw it in an ETF and watch it compound, and everything will be great and you'll make money, period. But here's the part of the conversation that didn't get told clearly enough. A significant contributor to those returns was the low rate environment itself, which tended to support higher valuations, particularly among growth-oriented companies. And when rates are near zero, future corporate earnings look more valuable today. That's what stock prices are based on. And high growth companies, like those large cap tech names that dominate most index funds right now, have been bid up to unbelievable valuations. But that experiment has now ended. And poor sweet Tina might be dead, or at least taking a very long nap. People have to figure out how to pivot towards the old normal. The speed limits, to belabor the metaphor a little bit, are back, which means the roads are going to get more congested. The commutes are going to take longer. Potentially the pace of the market returns themselves might change in the future. And when you can earn 4.5% to 5% on a treasury that's backed by the full faith of the United States government, stock market risk looks different. Not because stocks stopped working or because companies no longer have value, but because the alternative is no longer nothing. And that changes the conversation around allocation, around sequence of return risks, and around your retirement income and what it can actually produce in any given year. And the returns investors will demand from the higher risk of stock investments. And one thing I won't even have time to scratch the surface on is the part of the stock-heavy, sky-high return profile that most influencers and most people never talk about: taxes. I'm sitting down with new clients on a regular basis who want to unwind large cap tech, heavy stock positions, and we're having to be really strategic about how we do that because, and obviously I'm talking non-qualified accounts here, but the cap gain taxes on these gains are really hard for people to stomach. And don't get me wrong, that is a very good problem to have, but it is a problem nonetheless when we are modeling what someone's 1040 is going to look like if they want to sell out of some of these positions. And I'm not trying to prescribe anything specific here because every situation is different. Your timeline, your income needs, your tax picture, how close you are to retirement, all of it matters, and all of it is worth discussing with someone who knows your full situation. What I'm saying is the landscape shifted. A portfolio built for the old landscape may not be calibrated correctly for this one. And that is worth knowing, and that is worth revisiting and asking about. But before we move on, I want you to think about something. Which one of these changes are you actually feeling the most right now? Is it housing? Is it credit card debt? Is it that feeling that retirement seems further and further away than it did even a few years ago? Because for most people, it's not just one of them. It's several at the same time. For a lot of you, you're probably feeling the weight of all three. And that's what makes this moment feel very different. The end of the cheap money era didn't show up in one place. It's showing up everywhere. In housing, in borrowing, in investing, in government finance. The bill has arrived all at once. And the answer cannot just be keep kicking the can down the road. And I want to step back for 1 second before we go to the framework piece, because I think it's important to name something directly in our current culture and in our current information age. If everything I just talked through felt validating, if you've been walking around for 2 or 3 years wondering why everything is harder when the economy is supposedly strong, you are not imagining it. You're not bad at money. You're not making poor choices. Well, I shouldn't say that. I don't know you personally. I don't know if you're bad with money. I don't know if you've made poor decisions. Some of the loveliest people in the world are just so horrible with money. So I probably shouldn't make that blanket statement. But the reality is that we are all navigating the most significant rate environment shift in a generation, layered on top of the highest inflation in 40 years, layered on top of a housing market that got structurally frozen by the lock-in effect. You were handed a rulebook that no longer applies to most people. And most of what you're reading in headlines isn't telling you that clearly enough. Understanding the landscape doesn't fix everything overnight, but you cannot make good decisions with a bad map. And I hope today gave you a better one. So here are 5 questions worth bringing to your next financial planning conversation or just asking yourself as you navigate this ever-changing economic landscape. Question 1, does my current investment allocation reflect a 5% rate environment or the 1.5% one it was built for? If your portfolio was structured in 2019 or 2020, it was built for a world where bonds returned almost nothing and stocks were the only real growth engine. That world has changed. So whether or not you need to adjust it is a personal question specific to you, but it is helpful to think through. Question 2, what is my actual debt cost versus my actual investment return? And do I know the gap? This is the math that matters most right now for a lot of households. You've got to think through the sequencing of debt payoff versus investing. Because in this rate environment, the order of operations genuinely matters and it's very specific to your situation. But if you're prioritizing investment at, say, a 9% annual return, while you have a credit card balance compounding against you at 20%, your order of operations is very likely off, but you need to figure out what those numbers are. Question 3, am I holding cash in accounts that are losing ground to inflation? Because there are more attractive options now. T-bills, high-yield savings accounts are getting better, money market funds could be an option that weren't meaningfully competitive even a few years ago. Whether any of those tools are right for your situation is a planning conversation, but knowing the landscape has changed is step 1 in understanding what your cash position should look like and how big it should be. Question 4, what does my actual housing timeline look like, and does the lock-in effect change any part of that plan? If you're planning to buy in the next 12 months, the math looks different than if you're planning to buy in 5 years. Understanding those structural dynamics helps you have a much more grounded conversation about timing. And finally, question 5, what does my retirement income actually produce in this environment in real numbers? Not in theory, in numbers. If you haven't modeled that recently and you are close to or in retirement, it's definitely worth doing because the inputs have changed significantly since most plans were last revisited. Math, objectivity, and help from trustworthy advisors is where I would start. Now, I want to take a minute because I feel very strongly about this to talk about where you're actually getting your financial information right now. Because just in the week since I published that last video about bond yields, I have seen a lot more content about this end of the cheap money era. And some of it is really good, but some of it is designed to scare you into buying something like gold or crypto or an annuity or precious metals, or I've even seen offshore accounts, whatever it is. Here is my simple test. If someone is making predictions about the economy that also happen to perfectly explain why you should buy the exact product they sell, please be skeptical. Real financial planning doesn't work that way. Macro conditions are very complex. They don't solve neatly into one product being this universal perfect answer for everyone. And if you take the 5 minutes to run the scenarios through the basics of math, you start to realize how unreliable a lot of it actually is. And most of the people creating that content are not doing the math with your specific situation in mind. They're doing it with their business model in mind, or they're doing it with a brand deal in mind. So be careful who you take advice from. Ask the people you're listening to. Are you a fiduciary? Do you hold any professional designations? Are you legally required to act in my best interest, not yours? Are you under any level of regulatory scrutiny in what you put out and what you can and can't say? I am, and I think I absolutely should be. Those are not unfair questions. Those are the right questions, and anyone worth listening to will be able to answer them cleanly, clearly, and immediately. And as we come to the end here, if you followed me at all, you know that I always end with what I call a biblical frame, and it's where I take all of these macroeconomic finance topics and put it through the lens of what I believe as a follower of Jesus. So I have 2 thoughts today. The first is about stewardship when the landscape shifts. Proverbs 22 tells us the prudent sees danger and hides himself, but the simple go on and suffer for it. And prudence is not the same thing as fear. Prudence is not looking at a shifting rate environment and panicking. It is not moving everything to gold or Bitcoin or following the loudest voice on the internet or making reactive decisions because a headline scared you. Now, fear is real, it is valid, it doesn't need to be pushed aside or ignored, but it shouldn't drive your decisions. One of the reasons I personally became a student of economics and made a major career shift 4 years ago out of the institutional investing world and into the financial planning space wasn't just to try something new. It's because I have seen so many people, friends, family, former coworkers, all make financial missteps, not because of malicious intent, but because of a genuine lack of understanding about how money and our economic financial system all work. And I think it is especially important and prudent for believers to push back against that so we can be wise investors. And being a good steward of the resources you've been given is not necessarily complicated, but it does require you to actually engage with it. Not ignore it, not panic about it, engage. And as much as so many people on Wall Street want people to believe that it's just all too complex and only they really understand it, that's just simply not true. I've sat in enough rooms and on enough calls with Wall Street personalities to know for a fact that they are not smarter than you or anyone else. The simple person in that proverb doesn't get hurt because they're careless or malicious. They get hurt because they don't pay attention. They keep going on the same road without noticing that the road has changed underneath them. We're called to a deeper level of care and intention with the resources we've been entrusted with. And my second thought is about where our security actually lives. Because I think the free money era did something subtle and spiritually very dangerous to a lot of people. When money was cheap, when markets only seemed to go up, when home values doubled, when retirement accounts looked like they were generating wealth on autopilot and there was no signs of slowing down, it was very easy for a lot of people to feel financially secure, to trust the system, to feel like they had things under control. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with growing a portfolio. I'm a CFP. I believe deeply in sound financial planning and building monetary wealth responsibly for the sake of stewarding it well and giving a lot of it away in sacrificial generosity. But I think some of us, and I say us genuinely, started to put our security in the experiment and the cheap money itself, in the ETF performance, in the value of the house, and in this new era that's more volatile, where things are getting confusing and frustrating and the cost of everything is creeping up. It's exposed something, because where is our hope? If a spike in Treasury yields keeps you up at night, if the thought of a market drawdown makes you genuinely afraid, I want to gently ask, is that financial anxiety telling you something about where your security has actually been sitting? Our true home is elsewhere, and our hope is in Jesus. The portfolio is real, and it matters, and it deserves to be stewarded well, but it is also not permanent. It is not the foundation. The foundation is in the throne room of heaven, where God is and will always be seated on his throne. I think there is so much more peace available in this economic moment than most of the headlines are giving people permission to feel. Jesus never promised an easy life, but he did promise that his yoke is easy and his burden is light, meaning that even in uncertainty, we do not carry these burdens alone. He is inviting you into that, and I deeply want that for you as much as I want it for me. And for those of you who share this framework, let it give you freedom in this. You can engage and should engage with your finances seriously and wisely without fear, because the outcome was never entirely in your hand to begin with, and it's not ultimately about you and me. It's ultimately about us continuing to give glory to God. If this video raised questions about your specific situation, reach out or drop them in the comments. I actually try to read as many of them as I can. And if you haven't seen my video on why investors are getting nervous about the 5% yield, that's the foundation for everything we talked about today. I'll link it here, and I'll see you guys next time.